Hello, good morning. Once more, Ed Sambo here, and we are still on episode number 12 titled To Give or Not to Give Tithes. And we are now on part 2. And I hope that you had viewed my part 1 so that this part 2 you could understand it more fully. To start, I'm going to read in the book of Genesis, chapter 28, verse 20-22. It says, Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Some people will say that why is it that Jacob was fulfilling the law of tithing here? Please take note that the law of tithing was only established during the time of Moses. It was Moses' time when the law of tithing was enforced by God the Father, and the tribe of Levi was assigned to undertake this command of God, and during the time of Jacob, the law of tithing was not yet in existence. What Jacob promised to God was a vow that he will give God a tenth. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, verses 1-2, it states, This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham, returning from the defeat of the kings, and blessed him, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. The same thing with the case of Jacob. During the time of Abraham, the law of tithing was not yet in existence. It only came into existence during the time of Moses. When Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of the spoils of war, Abraham was not trying to obey the law of tithing, since there was not a law of tithing yet. Abraham gave this tenth to Melchizedek to show his respect to the king of Salem. Now, as you would notice, Jacob and Abraham existed before the time of Moses. And it says that Jacob made a vow of a tenth to be given to God, and Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Salem is the old name of Jerusalem. Now, if you are going to say, Jacob gave a tenth, Abraham gave a tenth. No, because during those times, there were no laws about tithing yet. The laws about tithing came into effect only during the time of Moses. And these laws of tithing was given to the tribe of Levi. I hope that is very clear. To continue, in the book of Matthew, chapter 28, verse 20, it says, Teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. In this verse, Christ was commanding the apostles to teach people all the laws that he had ordered. That means all the laws of Christ, not the laws of Moses. And tithing is part of the laws of Moses. Christ said, teaching them everything I had commanded you. He did not say teaching them everything I had commanded you and teaching them about the laws of Moses. He only said, teaching them the laws that I had commanded you. It do not include the laws of Moses. If pastors and other spiritual leaders will still insist on preaching the law of tithing, then try to consider this logic. In Malachi 3, verses 6 to 12, it is under the law of Moses, or let us say under the law of the Old Testament, and the spiritual leaders are imparting this law into their members, and they always say that they have to obey this law. Okay, we agreed on this issue, that it is under the law of Moses. Would you agree that the book of Leviticus is also under the law of Moses? Yes, it is under the law of Moses, just like all the other books under the Old Testament. So if you are obeying Malachi chapter 3, verses 6 to 12, would it be logical to say that you must also obey what is written in the book of Leviticus? Because in obeying the Bible, you could not just pick what pages you wanted to obey and disregarding the other pages, right? If you are obeying the law of Moses, then you have to obey all the laws that Moses had proclaimed in it. If you are obeying tithing in Malachi, then you also have to obey in the book of Leviticus, chapter 11, verses 1 up to 4 to 7. It states that God was telling the Israelites what are the clean and unclean food to eat. Let me specify in particular Leviticus chapter 11, verses 9 to 12, which states, "Of all the creatures living in the water of the seas and the streams, you may eat any that have fins and scales, but all creatures in the seas or streams that do not have fins and scales, whether among all the swarming things or among all the other living creatures in the water, you are to detest. And since you are to detest them, you must not eat their meat, and you must detest their carcasses. Anything living in the water that does not have fins and scales is to be detestable to you." On this book of Leviticus, we are also forbidden, excuse me, on the book of Leviticus, it says that you are not allowed to eat living creatures in the water, whether salt water or fresh water, that do not have fins and scales. Then under the law of Moses, you are not supposed to eat tahong, alimango, pusit, talaba, shellfish, and etc., etc., etc. As long as these creatures do not have fins and scales, you are not supposed to eat them, right? That was under the law of Moses. So if you are trying to obey the law of tithing under the book of Malachi, you are also supposed to obey the book of Leviticus, that you are not supposed to eat living creatures on the sea that do not have fins and scales. Then why are you eating those creatures nowadays with fins and scales? That is forbidden under the law of Moses. But let me remind you that this law which was mentioned in the book of Leviticus was exclusively for the Israelites only, just like the law of tithing, which was also exclusively only for the Israelites. Now then, why are we eating all these animals which were forbidden by God? The answer is Jesus Christ had already changed this law. And what law did Christ place in its place? To answer this question, let me go to the book of Mark, chapter 7, verse 19, which says, "For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body." In saying this, Jesus declared, all foods are clean. With this declaration of Jesus, we can now eat all the animals we want to eat. Just like in Malachi chapter 3 verses 6 to 12, Jesus had changed this law. In place of this law, Jesus had introduced 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 7 to 10, in which when you give, it has to be based on your heart's desire. So, when it says that Jesus had nullified the book of tithing, the law of tithing, that means to say, Jesus had already nullified what it says in the book of Leviticus. In this Christian dispensation, you could now eat creatures from the sea or from the river without fins and scales, because Jesus Christ had already declared that all foods on the earth could be eaten. It is now clean. These foods are now clean, and Christians could eat them. There's no problem about that. This is now under the law of Christ. Well, it seems that all these verses will prove that tithing should not be followed anymore. But if you still insist that tithing should be followed, try to consider the next two verses. The next two verses should strictly be followed together with the law of tithing if you are following the law of tithing. In the book of Numbers, chapter 18, verse 26, it states, "Speak to the Levites and say to them, when you receive from the Israelites the tithe I give you as your inheritance, you must present a tenth of that tithe as the Lord's offering." Numbers is still in the Old Testament. This verse states that after the congregation or the pastor had received all the tithes coming from the members of that congregation, a tenth of that tithe should be offered to God. Under the law of Moses, when you do your offering to God, that offering should be burned. Just to give an example, if the tithes accumulated had totaled 100,000 pesos, then a tenth of this is 10,000 pesos. Under this law, these 10,000 pesos should be burned as an offering to God. I never heard of any pastor yet who had burned money as an offering to God. In Tagalog it says, sayang. Therefore, leaders of these congregations should not refuse to obey this law, because this law also pertains to the law of tithing. If you want to follow Malachi 3, 6 to 12, then you also have to follow the book of Numbers, chapter 18, verse 26. It is very clear here that when a congregation received the tithes, a tenth of that tithe should be offered to God. And under the Old Testament, offering to God something, you have to burn it. Now, since the book of Numbers is in the Old Testament, a tenth of that tithes in money form should also be burned to God, because you are offering it to God. But no pastors had ever dared to do that, because they will not even dare to burn the money that they had received from tithes. And in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 26, verse 12, it says, when you have finished setting aside a tenth of all your produce in the third year, the year of the tithe, you shall give it to the Levites, the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied. This verse is very clear. Tithes which had been received by the congregation or the pastor should not only be used for the congregation's expenses, but a big part of that accumulated tithes should be spent for the poor people, the beggars, those people who are experiencing hardships in their lives, whether those people are members of that congregation or not. You should follow this law if you are following the law of tithing. It is really very clear then that after receiving all the tithes and after using those tithes to spend for the congregation's expenses, whatever remains of those tithes do not belong to the pastor, do not belong to the congregation anymore. Those tithes belongs for the poor people, for the widowed women, for beggars, for aliens who do not have anything to eat, do not have anything to spend. You have to give that tithes, the remaining of those tithes, to those people. So if you are trying to obey Malachi 3:6-12, you also have to obey Leviticus. You also have to obey Numbers. You also have to obey Deuteronomy. You could never say that I am just going to obey the book of Malachi. I am not going to obey the book of Leviticus. I am not going to obey the book of Numbers. I am not going to obey the book of Deuteronomy. You don't follow the Bible that way. You don't choose books or pages of the Bible that you only wanted to obey. If you read the Bible, if you follow the Bible, you have to obey everything. So if you decide to follow the book of tithing, you also have to follow all the laws about tithing which could be found on the books that I had mentioned. Excuse me. There are some congregations who are teaching that their members, that when you give your tithes, it has to be 10% of your gross income. And according to them, this is the least that you could give God. And according to them, you could not give only 10%, but you could even give up to 80% or to 90% of your gross income. The problem with this doctrine, like the least that you could give and giving up to 80 to 90%, cannot be found in the Bible. What is stated in the Bible under the law of tithing is just 10%. When you say that 10% is the least that you can give, it is tantamount to saying that God have given a law that you could not give your tithes if it is below 10% of your gross income. What if you could only afford to give 5%? Will this not be acceptable to God, since the least is 10%? At any rate, Christ had changed this law of tithing to the law of giving based on your heart's desire. To continue, let me go to the verses which could be found on the book of Matthew, chapter 5, 17-18. Because people will say, what about in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 17-18? Which states, do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Christ was the one speaking here. Christ has come to earth to fulfill the law, and that includes tithing. Okay, give me time to explain. First of all, the verse states to abolish the law. It did not say to abolish the law of Moses, right? If it is the law of Moses that was being referred to here, then why was Christ and his disciples were disobeying the law of the Sabbath when during the day of the Sabbath Christ was healing people? And this could be found in the book of John chapter 5 verses 8 to 10. And his disciples were trying to find some food. You could find this in the book of Matthew chapter 12 verses 1 to 2. These actions were prohibited during the day of the Sabbath. Excuse me. So the question is, what is this law that this verse is referring to? Is it the law of Moses or some kind of other law? As it was stated here, Christ is supposed to fulfill and not abolish this law. But the question is, what is this law that Christ is talking about? Is this the law of Moses? No. Because if this is the law of Moses, Christ would not have disobeyed the law of the Sabbath. The same thing with his disciples. So what is this law that Christ was talking about? In the book of 1 Timothy chapter 1 verse 9 to 11, it says, "We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for adulterers and perverts, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine that conforms to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which he entrusted to me." How can you apply the law of Moses to Christ when Christ is righteous? Can you tell Christ not to steal or kill and so on? The law of Moses does not cover the personality of Christ. So that law mentioned in the book of Matthew chapter 5 verses 17 to 18 is not the law of Moses, but that law pertains to the law given by God to Christ to obey. Just like what it said in the book of Luke chapter 24 verse 44, it says, "He said to them, 'This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms.'" So the law Christ was referring to was about himself, that he was going to be born in a manger, to be circumcised, to open his ministry, to teach, to die in the cross, to be alive again, and to ascend to heaven. These are the things that Christ has to fulfill while he was here on earth, not the law of Moses. Just what it says in the book of John, chapter 19, verse 30, it says, "When he had received the drink, Jesus said, 'It is finished.'" That was part of the law that Christ was supposed to fulfill. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, verse 7, it says, "Then I said, 'Here I am. It is written about me in the scroll. I have come to do your will, O God.'" This will that Jesus was speaking to is part of the law that Christ has to fulfill. So when it says that Christ said, "I will not abolish the law, I will fulfill the law," he was not referring to the law of Moses. Christ was referring to the law of God the Father, which God the Father gave to Christ to fulfill. That was the law. And that law pertains that he was going to be born in the manger. He was going to be baptized by John the Baptist. He was going to put up a ministry, and he was going to die 3 years after when he put up that ministry. And he is going to resurrect after 3 days. That was the law that Christ was trying to fulfill. That was the law that Christ could not abolish, because that law that he was trying to obey was the law of God the Father given to him, not the law of Moses. You had to take note of that. So Jesus Christ was not here to fulfill tithing, because tithing was under the law of Moses, and Jesus was not here to fulfill the law of Moses. It is very clear then, my fellow Bible-believing Christians, that these verses will fully explain that the law of tithing should not be enforced anymore in our time. If the churches are planning to ask for financial help from their members, they should not preach the law of tithing, but instead they should preach the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 7 to 10, which is the law of giving based on someone's heart's desire. There is nothing wrong in asking for financial help from members of the congregation. What is wrong is trying to ask financial help from them by using the law of tithing. It is very clear then that in our Christian dispensation, first of all, let me check how many minutes more. I still have at least 4 minutes to go. It is very clear that in our Christian dispensation, the law of tithing under the law of Moses is not in effect anymore, because Christ himself had deleted this law. And under this law, Christ had formed another law, which you could find in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 7 to 10, which says that if you want to help your church, if you want to help your congregation, if you wanted to help your fellowship, and if you wanted to support them financially, it is not because you are obeying the law of tithing. It is because you are giving to your heart's desire. You are a cheerful giver. You are not a cheerful tither. And anyone who is trying to enforce this law of tithing is like putting Christ to shame. It is like slapping Christ on the face, because Christ said, I had changed this law of tithing. So, tithing is not being observed under our Christian dispensation, because tithing is not under the law of Christ. So if you insist that tithing could still be enforced, then I could only say that you are totally wrong. It is erroneous. It is unbiblical, because this tithing is part of the Old Testament, and we are now obeying in the Christian dispensation the New Testament, or under the law of Christ. So my fellow Bible-believing Christians, I know that you will not agree with me, but when I discussed this topic, I had presented so many Bible verses. And if you try to say that these Bible verses are wrong, then it is tantamount to saying that you yourselves are saying that the Bible is wrong, isn't it? So when it says that Christ said, if you want to help your congregation, you should give according to your heart's desire, not according to the laws of Moses of tithing, that you are obliged to give 10% of your gross income. It is not wrong to give money to your congregation, to help the congregation. But what is important, when you give financial help to your congregation, it has to be based in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 9 verses 7 to 10, that you have to give according to your heart's desire. I have to end this now because I am now on the 30th minute of my recording. I hope that you had understand tithing, whether to give tithes or not to give tithes. The right doctrine is we are not obliged to give tithes anymore under this Christian dispensation. So, to my fellow Bible-believing Christians, until my next broadcast next week, please stay put, and I hope that this discussion had enlightened your mind about tithing. Till next week, I could say bye-bye. Thank you very much.